Checking if we are live right now on YouTube. Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma. And I think I should now say your host and host, as you might have heard in many Bollywood movies. And I'm back with the lectures. I'm very happy to host these lectures again in 24. The entire 23 year went by, but we couldn't do lectures because we were busy with all our academic works. I've been trying to complete a book, and a lot of things are in the store for all of you at Carvan and various places where you might be able to get those. But anyhow, we are back, and I think I'm very happy to start this session, this series of sessions with a brilliant lecture. This lecture is going to talk about a lot of various issues, ranging from the space for women in colonial Bengal to law. And the legal issue has been, I think, is at the center point. In the last few months, we have seen the Indian Penal Code being changed to the Bharat Nyaya Sanhita and other kind of nationalized um, forms of legal systems. But this is not about that. This is another more interesting facet of the whole story. Today, the lecture is on concubinage, race, and law in early colonial Bengal, bequeathing intimacy, servicing the empire. This is based on a book written by our guest today, Dr. Ruchika Sharma. She is an assistant professor of history, teaching undergraduate students at Delhi University, my alma mater, and has been teaching there since 2006. She has done her honors in history from St. Stephen's College in 2001 and got her doctorate from CHS, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2012. She currently teaches at Mata Sundari College for Women, and she has been exploring and published around themes like mixed race domesticities, legal history, Notch women, courtesans, European traveler, and service culture, social history, historical understanding of literary figures. A lot of these things we are going to explore in today's lecture. And I think this is the best beginning of this series of lectures that we are going to host on Karwan. So without further ado, I'll be interacting with Dr. Sharma after the lecture. So stay back. If you have any questions for our speaker today, you can drop them in the live chat. I'll be happy to read them out for you. And thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for accepting our invitation, for being on the platform. It is such an honor hosting you this evening. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thanks for that lovely introduction that you've given. And I think I'm really thrilled to be at a platform that I've been following since its inception. The COVID years, were made a little lighter for all of us who could access, a journey you started, and I'm glad that you took all of us on that journey. And the range and the diversity of lectures that you brought into our lives during COVID, and I'm glad it is continuing and branching out to different directions. So I'm really, really glad for that. And the diversity right now, also, you're sitting under a fan and I'm with my woolens, for the lecture. So thank you so much. I'll be starting my lecture. And before I do that, I want to show this book. The cover is made by my very dear friend, Nafisa Ali Sayed. She has basically reproduced a will that I've used from 18th century and written in the same calligraphic hand that was used in the 18th century wills, the archive that I've used for my work. Before I go on, I'll quickly start by sharing my screen. Please let me know once you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. No, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my lecture, as Ishan said, is titled Concubinage, Race and Law in Early Colonial Bengal, Bequeathing Intimacy and Servicing the Empire. Now, my book basically tries to look at the relationship between the British men and, within quotes, native women. Now, I know the word native is extremely loaded and problematic word, but the reason I'm using this word is that's what the archives, the legal archives, uses the term. And in an 18th century understanding of the world in the early colonial phase, It means anybody who's not completely European. So you could be half European, half Indian. You could be one fourth, Portuguese, one fourth British, and rest half Indian. But unless and until you are completely white, again, another problematic word, but let me say it, you will be called the word native. So the archive also tells us, the era in which it is being written, and which has been my historical interjection, that do historians only look at the sources, or they also inquire about the choice of the words they are studying? That's where interdisciplinarity comes in. So the attempt basically was to read these wills and to retrieve the history of native women. Now, as a historian who works on early medieval India, engages with Mughal women very often too, we are told that women's history is difficult to sort of write. It doesn't exist. Although I'm glad for past 20, 25 odd years it has changed. I mean, so many scholars have made interjections and said that let's re-look at the existing archives, or let's sort of have newer archives, expand what we understand as historical records or historical sources. That's what I have attempted to do in my work. So what I did was I tried to study a large number of wills that are left by the British men who came in their official or economic capacity to India in the early colonial period. They are catalogued and housed, one in Kolkata, in the national in the High Court, Calcutta, as well as in the OIOC, the British Library. The original ones are perhaps in Kolkata, and their copies are there in London. Now, what these wills do, they give a snapshot of what the lives would have been. Now, traditionally thinking, you would imagine a will is somebody bequeathing somebody something, leaving property, leaving things. How do we study them as historical records? What do they tell us about these women? Now, when I began my research, it was as early as 2004. I was an MPhil student at JNU. The only approach that we had seen to understand the native women in any kind of interpersonal relationship with British men was a very romanticized version. Of course, there were elite men who left us so many records, who had their letters, their private papers, they had their BBs, painted by these wonderful portrait painters and other painters coming to India from England looking for work, India being the land of opportunities for them. And the other approach was to look at all Indian women in such relationships as slaves. Now, as a historian, we are constantly trying to go beyond binaries. History always looks very beautiful in binaries because it feels it's easier to understand. But a historian, by their craft and by their training, always complicates the issues. We will not tell you yes or no. We will tell you an answer which will be beyond yes or no. Right? So that's what the attempt has been. That can we understand the thousands of native women who would have been living in with these British men in their households, and I'll talk about them in detail. And by how do we do that? The other sort of archive where these women existed were the baptism records of the children that were born. Unless and until these women were also baptized, there would be a question mark on the baptism record in the name of the mother. If the child dies early, and on the tombstone, if the mother was not a baptized person, the mother's name will have a question mark, which was a way to know that the mother of the child was for sure a native woman. Other than that, people would say, "Oh, very rich women would cohabit with British men. Otherwise, why would they?" Other scholars have used these wills to enumerate, but I wanted to use these wills to understand the everyday lives. So women's histories are not revolutions, they are not big changes, they happen in our everyday living. So how are they being mentioned in these wills? What are the names that are being mentioned? Can we figure out, can we sort of locate them geographically somewhere? Can we locate them as per their religion, their caste identities? Can we understand how long have they been living in with these men? Who are these women and what is their class location? Whether they come from very rich families, middle class or lower middle class families, or even lower class families. Why are they living in with these men? Do they have any independence? Do they leave one man and go to the other one? What does society think about them? Who are their children? What's happening with their children? What are they being given in these wills? Do they do something with that, or is it just like a cold trace? We don't get anything after that. So these were the questions that I had when I began my research, and I'll try and answer some of these questions that I have tried to address in these book. So, as I said that the wills do talk about some mundane everyday living experiences and impressions of the other. In travel writing, of course, it comes across much more, and I'll talk about that just after this. But the discourses on race, gender, sexuality, and their intersection happens beautifully in a legal archive. And again, this is something many scholars have worked and brought out beautifully in their own works and researches. But I wanted to look at the lives of these women, their domesticity, the interracial connections, the lives of their children, the stereotypes that these women sort of were constructed through in the travel writings. So these early interactions manufacture the later acceptance of the colonizer and the colonized, which means the late second half of the 19th century largely. The first chapter that I have is called Beyond the Parda, Constructing the Native Women. I'm going to read a will to you before I go on. I humbly request that the Honorable Court of Directors, India Affairs, and the Honorable Governor General and Supreme Council of Bengal will so far look into the superintend my affairs, that a true state of my estate may be laid before them. Also, my length of the service and large family of children I have left to be brought up, both legitimate and illegitimate, the latter arising from the vigor of youth under the influence of hot climate, distance from my country, and cut off from every possibility of forming a more credible and honorable connections at an earlier period. I therefore trust they'll be considered as deserving of protection and meet with indulgence from my honorable employers, for they are essentially the children of necessity, and alas, the law proves a cruel stepmother to them. Unquote. This is the will of Major Andrew Wilson Hearsay, a captain in military service of the East India Company, Bengal establishment. The will is dated 1798. Now, here some very interesting terms are being mentioned. You would wonder why is the weather being mentioned. Now, please keep in mind that very often the terms that we use for the weather or even for land are extremely sexualized. So think of the word virgin land, right? Unconquered land becomes virgin land. Something similar that we sort of use for women's bodies, right? Other than that, when we do talk about and read the way in which the tropical lands are being mentioned, so things like how the women of hot weather they sexually ripened faster, which is why the early marriages. And these examples are filled in the travel writing, not just to India, but think of Asia and Africa and other parts. Wherever the colonizers go, this stereotype, and that stereotyping is very gendered kind of stereotyping. So the idea here, the other word, very interesting word, is they place legitimate and illegitimate children both together, and the word used in the legal archives is natural. So wherever they mention natural children, it means they are children born without a wedding between the parents. Now, so travel literature also creates these kind of stereotypes, but in various ways. One of the things that really fascinated me in my reading of travel literature, that how the women of Zanana, women that these men could hardly ever see, are as sexualized as the women who would be bathing at the ghats, the sari of the women filling water, a very, very mundane task, taking water home for your household work, to Notch Girl, the public performer whose performances were hardly ever seen for their artistic merit, but largely for the body that she was, and what the kind of pantomime, as they call it, some British writings, the monotonous sounds of the bells on their feet. So the ghungru is referred to in that ways. You realize that the sexualization of the women's body, the native women's body, is how they are constructing. Now you wonder, why is this important? Because before they enter into a relationship with these women, in the concubinage, the entire structure of concubinage, there are also these, British minds who are viewing these women through the literature that is being constantly produced, written, published, and being sent back home. So when they come here, they already have these stereotypes, they already have these images, because from as early as 16th century, these texts are being written in various European languages that, that they would have had access to. But what is interesting is that all of these, like one of the examples that I really like is how Thomas Rowe, while passing through a bazaar, he comes across these, elite women who are in a palki. They are, of course, in a parda, and he hears them giggle at him. He hears these multiple women giggle, and he really feels very conscious, and he kind of feels powerless because they can see him, and in turn he cannot see them, right? So you realize that this kind of the fact that he notices that and mentions that in his text. But other than that, a lot of writings of the zanana, of the elite, zananas, the Mughal rulers as well as the nobility, is very often very similar, to the Ottoman and Turkish harems that they have been writing. It's almost like homogenized kind of a sexualized space that they write about. Similarly, about the Nautch girls as well. Although I must say that almost all the travel writers will talk about the Nautch women. And they are often painted, even taken pictures of, and they become an extremely popular figure also because music not only is a part of the cultural life, but very often the social and religious part of the Indian life as well. Something that for British men remains very fascinating, because the very, very binary kind of understanding of domestic women and public women, it doesn't exist as binary in Indian scenario as it does for them back at home. So these are some images that I wanted to sort of show you, and also wanted to highlight this idea that travel writing very often is not an innocent act all the time. There's a very powerful stance, that you have when you describe somebody else. It's like the West knows the East better than the East knows itself, kind of a syndrome. So travel writing entails itself a power, the painting of the natives, the portraying of the natives, whether in black or white or on the canvas. It carries with itself the power of defining somebody for the rest of the world to see for a long time to come. These are some of the paintings of the ayahs, female attendant. Again, extremely vilified figures at times, because they're constantly in close contact with the white bodies, the children of the Mem Sahib. And this is something I really find fascinating, that the Mem Sahibs are often vilified in the sense that once Mem Sahib began to come to India, the distance between the natives and the white men began to increase. Again, it's a very problematic, sort of a simplified way of looking at history, because the white woman, the Mem Sahib, is as much part of an imperial patriarchy, as the native women is a part of the colonized patriarchy, right? She is expected to behave in a particular way. And how fascinating and interesting it is that both these women, native and the British, are juxtaposed with each other. There was this quote I remember reading that, a man, can only remain proper under the gaze of the women of his race. So the white women are also sort of saddled with a particular responsibility to keep their men in line. And once they try to do that, they are vilified in a very sexist and misogynistic way as well. So it's like a do or die situation for them. If they do this, then they are doomed. If they don't, then they are doomed as well. But the gendered juxtaposing is what I'm talking about. And again, going beyond these white women versus native women binary as well. We need to look at the domestic servants. We need to look at the ayah in a more nuanced way. I think Martha Sherwood's novel, again, The Ayah, also brings out the religious aspect. If we have time, maybe we'll take it up towards the end. Now, coming to the very important part of what I looked at was forging intimacies. So I want to start by the quote by one of my favorite scholars, Anne Laura Stoller. A romanticized view of these domesticities, or even the focus on management of intimate, leads to a tenderized study of colonialism if it ignores the violence and inequities lodged in a privatized space and turns away from the uses and abuses that unsolicited and even desired intimacies may entail, unquote. Now, so this is a painting I really like. I thought I wanted to show it to you all. Now, when you look at the idea of intimacies, forging intimacies, I'm often asked if I find love in my research. And I mean, I don't think people like this answer when I tell them, no, I usually don't. I tell them, you find everything in legal archives but love. You might find, money, you might find violence, you might find disputes, you might find sexual violence, but you will not find love. Because that's not the place where it's something that is expressed. So how do we then understand these intimacies? Why do I talk about the word intimacies here? There were certain themes that I came across while I was figuring out what should be the format of talking about these. Do I go by decades, 80s, 90s, 1800s? Should I go by that? Or should I divide these wills by the civilian British men writing and the ones in the armed services? But I thought that will become too easy. And I really wanted to complicate the argument by looking at the themes, that if I look at these wills, suppose 150 wills, what are the themes that come out in these? So what will happen is that some will have multiple aspects that I wanted to look at, and some will only fit in one category of my study. So some of the themes that I wanted to discuss, I'll keep giving examples and we can discuss them later. One was the popular names and unknown identities. So many a times these women would not be referred to by their actual names. Now that renders women, as nameless entities. So their names at times mentioned, at times will be reduced to Betty, Polly, Mary, and many other English names. Now, one of the very simple ways of looking at it, maybe they wanted to give them names that were easier to pronounce, familiar for them in their language. But then these men came to India learning the languages. I don't think that would have been the reason. Also remember that naming and renaming women is also about power. Women have been renamed in so many cultures, even at times post marriages. Sometimes it is expected out of them, right, that they will change their names. So it's not something that one would be surprised at. So I think it's a lot to do with the fact that it could be a sense of possessiveness, a possession, also defining somebody in a particular way. One of these wills that I came across, where the woman is mentioned, her name is Elizabeth, and her name carries 5 different surnames. So the British man who's leaving the property to her wants to clarify which Elizabeth he is talking about. And the 5 surnames that her name carries must have been 5 different partners, the British partners, who she must have lived with. So all the alias, so Elizabeth Cordray, alias Elizabeth so-and-so is mentioned in that will, because legal documents should make sure this is the right person the property or the bequeath is going to. But it was fascinating to sort of read how naming and renaming sort of can create and sort of erase identities for us as well. The second aspect was acquiring a BB. I know the word acquiring seems now difficult, but how would these relationships will be formed? Richard Blichenden, his diaries, which are I think about 80 odd diaries, Professor Peter Robb has done 2 books on the same person's diaries. There he gives some very interesting ways in which these relationships could be conducted. In the wills, however, you come across some stories being mentioned, somebody saying certain thing of how they acquired a BB. Similarly, some wills will carry the information of, buying. For example, Claude Martin, the famous school of Lamartine, was sort of started by him. Claude Martin's will talks about that he acquired his BBs by buying them. And then very quickly goes on to explain that he bought them in the sense he did not want their natal families to have any rights over them, and that the women were independent to study and continue education as per their own religious customs. And even when they come of age, he asks them if they want to marry somebody else, but they chose to marry him. That's what the will says. Similarly, William Hickey's memoirs talk about one of the hirkaras, one of his, domestic servants, coming to him telling that there's a BB who needs her debts paid off. And if he can do that, she can join his household. So we also see a social network of domestic servants who would be introducing the native women at times to their sahibs who might be looking for a native partner to live in with. Now, this is something paid for their service. This notion sort of really cancels out for us the romanticized idea of love, a very sort of white Mughalish kind of a way in which these domestic relationships can't be studied only in one way, right? Because there is unmistakably a lot of references to money in these wills. There are court cases. The only thing is, because the British government never made a policy, they never saw this as a service in their own writing. They never had a sort of a payment or a kind of a mention of wages. But when you look at the wills, so somebody's will saying that I owe her the wages for last few months, or in my conscience I have not given her the wage for last month, but I'm leaving her so and so. So you realize that almost all the wills which leave the property, if not all, I would say most of them, have some mention to remuneration, the wages, and the women being paid something, for having lived in or living in with the British man. That complicates the matter. That brings me to the second part of my title, that these women in a way are servicing the empire, because these are the men who are creating the empire, so to speak. Now, the other, kind of apart kind of a thing that you come across is the terms. Some of the terms in which the way, I mean, the BBs are mentioned, they are so affectionate. So saying my loving companion, my female friend, somebody, saying that how she took care of me in my years of illness. And this is something that is mentioned in whichever part of the world the colonial men cohabited with the local or the native women. Now, William Thompson, who wrote his detailed, work on his, being a part of the Bengal establishment, in 18th century, talks about how handy these women could be. Now, again, what really sort of hits you is that he mentions them for the service they were providing. They were taking care of them. They were taking care of their household activities, their household duties. And this is where the class issue also comes in. This is something I'm talking about again and again in my work, because you cannot ignore the class markers. Now, here, the euphemism that we have being used for the BB, the native mistress, is a housekeeper. Now, my argument is she's not a housekeeper as a euphemism. She's actually keeping his house. If the man is somebody who is a middle class or a lower class official, could be both civilian or military, she's actually sort of minding his house. The other euphemism that is often used is washerwoman. Again, not a euphemism. It's actually the services she's providing. She's not just his sexual partner, mother of his children. Also, as roles, she's often mentioned, she's often called the mother of my children, the mother of my child, by the way. So, but to take care, to provide the service of care work is something she's constantly referred as. Now, mixed race social space was something I wanted to see if these families interact with each other. So, as a rule, the families with Mem Sahibs as wives would not socialize with the families where they were native mistresses. But amongst each other, again, how do the wills tell us? So some wills will have the man leaving something for his friend's BB, out of his respect, his fondness for her. Oh, I thought she would like it, so leaving something for the BB. And that's how you realize that they would have had social connections, a kind of sort of social space where they would have interacted with each other as well. The other aspect was polygamy. Again, brings us to the issue of class. Not every British man living in India could have afforded to have multiple, intimate partners, to run a household with, multiple partners living at the same time. Although, because wills do not care to explain at times, we do not know if the women who are mentioned, if they're living together at the same time, or is it at different times. However, some wills will tell you that, my zanana, there are wills that mention the word zanana. In my zanana, there are two of these, and they'll say that both of them are expecting children. So that's how you sort of realize that these are polygamous. Now, keep in mind that in the 18th century, these British men are inhabiting a space where the Mughal, Mansabdars, the local Bengali zamindars are the symbols of power, their life and lifestyle. So having a house in the city and a house like a bagan bari, a garden house where they'll have the mistress for the weekend. These are the kind of symbols or class markers that many of these men would have wanted to emulate. Think of David Akhtarlani, who would be traveling on these elephants with his entire Zanana, the Delhi resident. So you realize that the British men had stepped in an 18th century structure. The whole infamous Nabob, the British men who came to India and went native, that's the term used for them. Although I think going native would have a lot to do with the weather, the environment, and also to speak the language of power that the people of that area understand. So extremely a practical aspect perhaps as well. But yes, polygamy does become one of the aspects I came across in these wills. Now, the next aspect I want to talk about is conditions. So there were certain conditionalities in the wills. Now, the wills, when they leave the bequeath to these native women, you would see a very interesting pattern. You would not have women left entire property. You would not have the women being left the money entirely. So she will be left the property to be used during her natural life. And after that, it will either go to the children with that woman, or sometimes, if there are no children, to the family back in England. Now, if you look at the law in England at this time as well, the law of coverture, you realize that whenever a woman would marry a man, even the property her father gave her would become the man's, right? So British are perhaps carrying their own understanding of property. However, having said that, there are also wills where the women do get the entire property. They get the entire, and at times you find these very, British spellings of, the local areas, the markets, and the colonies that are there in Calcutta. Even now, I've been to Calcutta extensively, so I know that area. But you have the spellings, and they'll define that how many, the bigha and this area. Sometimes the garden house is also left to the BB. And then you have these BBs leaving wills, which also gives us an idea into what is their social structure. So BBs leaving their wills, there are at least 7 to 8 wills. But what is lost is that you never get to know what language the BB would have dictated the will in. There was one will which said that the BB spoke in Persian. The will was in Persian, which means she must have spoken in one language, but the person writing wrote in Persian. Or somewhere where it says the will was in Bangla, but they don't reproduce the will, because it will be so amazing to hear the words they would have used for themselves, right? How they saw themselves. What is the Bangla term they use for themselves, or any other language for that matter? Does the politics of transliteration, sort of makes us lose out on such an important detail from history? My faithful servant. Now, this was again a term that the British would mention their BBs, my faithful. So the idea again perhaps being that despite being non-marital relationships, faithfulness was something that was expected, from these women. There's a very, sort of funny, incident mentioned by William Hickey in his memoirs about the alleged infidelity, where the child who is born is darker in complexion, and how one day sees the gardener leaving the bedroom when he comes back early. So the whole idea that he perhaps believes that the child is not his, but the gardeners. So such things are also sort of giving us a marker that despite not being married, they were expected to be faithful, because my faithful servant, of the word faithful is used very often while describing the BB. Now, families here and there meant that many wills talk about families back in England, as well as the family, with the native women here in India. Both coexist and both are mentioned, because these men would be writing their wills either when they think they might be sort of not surviving, or when they are going back. Both possibilities are there, because very often you try and look for these men, you sort of Google their names, the family trees, or some kind of generational way of finding where the families are. Since these men, at least most of the wills that I saw were the wills of the most common people around, you do not find anything. So it's very sad to say that these wills are the only places where not just these native women, but even these men writing these wills probably existed. We do not know anything else about them other than how they mention themselves in these wills. Now, the last aspect of this particular chapter was familial intimacy. There were wills that will only talk about the native women and the children with her. Nobody else is mentioned. Perhaps maybe they might have a family, but the fact that one entire will talks about the only person they feel they want to leave something to, or they want to mention, when they're thinking about their death, or they're actually closer to their death, is an Indian, mistress and the child. And sometimes the length of the relationship is 35 years, 30 years. At times, multiple partners are being referred to, but nonetheless, they're the only ones who are mentioned in the wills at times. So it creates the idea of familial for the British men in India as well. Now, but that's not the only aspect that you see in these wills. So there were the aspect of legality where property becomes an issue. There is violence, both physical as well as sexual, and there is discord. Now, I've already spoken about bequeathing until her natural life and the British legal structure as the reason for it. I've also spoken about, when the women write their wills. I mean, I think I saw about a couple of them, but they were some of them were from women from well-known family like the Ricketts family, and how she leaves her trinkets to the Khansama and something else to her granddaughter, and again giving us an idea of the social structure. She also mentions the house where she lives in Calcutta. Now, coming to the disputed domesticities, I think that's what becomes important. That rather than taking a very romanticized view of domesticities, we ought to also look at that disputed domesticities existed in these records. So, for example, there's a case of Henry Pine and Piru Bibi. What was fascinating for me in the court case of 1790s was the language and some of the information we could gather about the native women, what her family thinks of her. So, Piru Bibi lived in with Henry Pine, who was in Chittagong. And he apparently came into her house one day after she had left him because of some dispute. He took away some jewelry and money, which is hers. Now, her sister, Piru's sister, says that she was the sole bread earner of our family, and that the jewelry that Henry Pine has taken has not been given by him. She then gives the names of the other British men that Piru had lived in previously, and how it was the jewelry given by them to her. Now, she also says that Piru had traveled with him, but he hasn't paid the wages for that time to Piru. These are all being mentioned in the court, and the court cases being fought. But sadly, the case is decided, and Henry Pine is acquitted without even hearing the entire evidence. After a few months of this case, Henry Pine's license to trade is revoked on the account of him being extremely violent. So, whereas in the hearing, the witnesses keep calling him, with such grand and great names, but nobody talks about the other side of his in the case. The next case that I quickly want to talk about, but it's a case which has so much happening, which is Bhagwan Kovar and William Orbe Hunter. Now, this is a case that other scholars have also looked at from a different perspective. I wanted to read the language. It's a very long court case. I mean, if I could, I would have reproduced the entire, case in my book. Now, here, some interesting things are happening. One, both the lawyers are fighting whether concubinage should be seen as a contract or a service. Now, I mean, while making the judgment, it's very sad that they don't take it into consideration, but that's a very long debate during the course of the trial. Now, here, the other thing that becomes clear is the class issue. Now, William Orbe Hunter has Bhagwan Kovar as his mistress, but there are other women who are servants and slaves, very specifically mentioned in the trial. Now, what happens is that the nose and ear of one of the servants has been cut off. Now, we do not know whether whether Bhagwan Kuvar does it or it is William Orbe Hunter. Now, the entire case goes on, but we find these small details of the household. So, for example, the servants give the testimony that how Bhagwan Kuvar does not do any household work. In fact, they say that we have seen Mr. Hunter carrying breakfast to the bedroom for her. Now, just contrast this with the washerwoman euphemism for a native mistress. Here, very clearly, she is the mistress of the house with servants, slaves who are doing the entire work of the household for her. Now, to sort of cut the long story short, in the end, uh, the punishment is given to both of them, where the major punishment is to Bhagwan Kovar, because she's been brought up in the land of vice and habituated to it, the case says. And William Orbe Hunter, because he's been brought up in the land, in England, so he could not have, done this. But because he allowed it to happen in his household, he's punished for it. Now, the other cases that I saw, two of them were rape cases. And, in one of the cases, again, I'm coming back to the character of Aya, the midwife's testimony is taken. Now, midwife's testimony is a very sort of done legal procedure in the rape cases. And the rape happened in cases of both the girls are extremely young. In one, the midwife claims that the girl hasn't even reached the puberty, and Justice Hyde asks the French man who has been, allegedly raped the girl, the young child, didn't he feel ashamed of laying with a woman, a girl child, actually, he says. So he says, no, she told me that she's not a maiden. And the fact that she was present in a mixed race area, he assumed that she was available to become his sexual partner. Now, both the cases, one, the midwife is an Indian woman, and other one where the examination is done by an English doctor. In his case, his testimony clinches the case, and in her case, her testimony is not even given any importance. A very, very sort of, and if you read the later works like Professor Charu Gupta's work, etc., and how the Aya is vilified a lot more in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and if you read the text by Martha Sherwood, the novel The Aya, you realize that a lot of what gets, very officially, very by acts and rules, condemned, whether it's the Notch, whether it is the Devdasis, whether it is the Aya, all these are characters that have been seen in a very different way in the early colonial period. But how that becomes a way to reach here, and that is why the early colonial period becomes a very fascinating period. Because on the one hand, we are going beyond the binary of colonizer and colonized, but we are still seeing the spectrum of relationships between these two are the sort of foundation on which the colonial state is constructing its mindset on what to legalize, what to control, what to prohibit, etc. I mean, I would want to argue it a lot more, but let me quickly come back to my the last part of the book, the last chapter. It's called The Interracial Progeny. I'll quickly read this will of Major Thomas Adderley in the service of the Honorable United Company of Merchants of England, trading for East Indies, 1783 is when the will is filed. I bequeath to my natural daughter, whom I have called Elizabeth, and who goes home to Europe in the same ship with myself, the sum of £3,000 sterling to be paid to her on attaining the age or of 21 years or the day of marriage, whichever shall happen first. Now here, I like what I've highlighted here, who goes home to Europe. Very clearly, the man sees the home of his child as, Europe. Now, what changes is that in the 1790s, sometimes it's very, fleetingly called from Warren Hastings to Cornwallis, the shift. I think in the social spaces, these changes begin to reflect almost around the same time. I mean, sometimes I would like to say slightly earlier as well, because 1790s is when the Anglo-Indian children get a slab that they cannot go beyond a particular position in the railways. And you also see these changes of, these children not being sent back to Europe largely. I mean, again, I think the class could be an issue, but a lot of schools, orphanages begin to open up for these children in India. Okay, I think there's other aspect, and I'll just discuss these points with you after this will. Now, this is a will. Again, you will wonder that, how would a will carry, a kind of uh, changing attitude. Now, look at the year of the will. This is 1819. And in my research, this is the time when you almost don't see Native women being mentioned in the wills. I don't think the phenomena of cohabitations, mixed race household would have abruptly stopped. Yes, one argument that there were more mem sahibs, there are more men coming, with their wives, or the white women are there for them to have a household. But very often in the travelogues and the letters, they will say that you can have an entire sort of zanana of native women at the same cost to have a white, a white wife, perhaps hinting at the fact that some of the things that she might be buying must be imported from Europe, because that's the kind of household food, etc., they must be used to as they're just reaching here. But other than that, what is also sort of happening here is that the native women are not being mentioned, because in the Mufassil areas, in the areas away from the presidency towns, uh, there are not as much, sort of European company in terms of, marriageability or even sociability. So it's hard to imagine that this phenomena would have come to an end. What has actually happened is that people may not be mentioning the native women. So I read this will, Charles Nicholson Sr., who chastised his British children about their prudent behavior. I start. I recommend to my children to conduct themselves prudently, pay proper respect and attention to their mother in all things proper, and do nothing of importance without previously consulting two or three honest, prudent, respectable people, respecting the propriety of the measure. I likewise recommend them not to associate or form a family connection with black or dark brown native uh, proteges or any other low description of people, but with honest, industrious Europeans of respectable character in a situation to maintain them comfortably. Now, here the color is being specified, and this is something we also came across, in these balls being organized, these dancing charity events, where if the mixed race, women or daughters of these relationships who were studying, who were taught certain, technical things, they were given education. If they were fairer complexion, there were chances that British men might choose them as their marriage partners were more. But if they were not fairer complexion, the chances would go, sort of difficult for them. So these kind of things start to get mentioned in the sources and in the records. I think I would like to sort of come to the end of my talk by sort of highlighting certain points and certain things I thought I wanted to emphasize. So while it's true that there is no dedicated archive for Native women, if that they exist in completely for themselves, we don't have them talking, we don't have, I've been asked if there are Bangla sources, or even the novels and stories, they start from the 20th century. I would not consider them, sort of authentic records of 18th century, actually. Yes, a story, a telling of somebody's impressions, but they're not primary sources for an 18th century historian. So what is important is for me that there is no dedicated archive, but it's, that itself proves that there is a gendering of the archive. It's not that women don't exist. It is women's history doesn't exist in them. That's the problem. So what was it about the native woman and her relationship with the British man that made her remain unnamed alternatively named, or even to get mentioned as a role. So oftentimes the women do not get mentioned, by their names, but by the roles they play. My faithful friend, the mother of my children. So she's the role that she's playing, which also makes me determined to believe that they're important for what they provide, to these men who are constructing the empire. Now, the natives and how they were impacted by colonial policies from the 18th to early 19th century. It's not that they're denied in their presence in the history, their version of it. So when I hear her Piru Bibi's sister talk about it, when I hear Piru Bibi's brother coming and talking about it, I don't even know what language they are speaking in. So some wills will say, oh, this Pathan girl, this Rohilla girl, this Bengali woman, I got this woman, she came from up the country, but that's it. All I have is their geographical location at times and nothing else about them, not even their original names. Although to say the other thing also, there are at times women who are referred to as their complete name, sometimes with a lot of, like the William Palmer talks about his partner, her complete name, Skinner, for example. But also, it also shows a kind of class consciousness, perhaps a kind of education that could be attached to it, come to think of it. So we do have the natives in the history. It's not that they're erased, but we don't get their version of history at all. It's almost as if it doesn't matter to those recording their history. Similarly, the issue of class, I think I would not let go of that because it tells us that there are so many kinds of history as there are people. You do not want to have, either rich women cohabited with British men or either poor women did that. No, that sort of robs us of the history. It tells us that history can be this or that when a historian should totally deny that. As historians, we have a very precarious responsibility on our shoulders that we should not give simple answers. One, I don't think people cannot understand, complex histories. They do. We need to make a little more attempt to do that. Give them histories with interpretations, with sources, and even in the terms of writing popular histories are popular for a reason, but that doesn't mean that serious academic histories cannot make an effort to reach out to people, complicate the issue, let people know that this is the history that we are researching. If I have spent 16 years in doing my research, I will not want to make it into a binary history. I will complicate, yes, in a way in which the other person feels interested to sort of open my book and read it. Now, there's also low-ranking British individuals or officials who may not have had host of servants in their household, but do their histories not matter? Of course they do. And the fact that wills become such an equalizer in that sense, because wills talk about both, I mean, all kind of men, all ranks of men, in fact, if I can say. And what I would want to sort of stop at here is that these women, yes, they exist only in this. So I'm often asked, how is my work different from so and so? And so I want to tell them that this is not just sort of, I'm not the first one to look at the wills. No, not at all. But I would want to look at the language of the wills, because when historians read a will of 18th century, they will contextualize it from the perspective of the 18th century. And that's what I've tried to do. When I talk about 19th century, I will be very, very careful in doing that, because there is no way I'm going to take a jump from mid 18th century and reach straight away to the 19th century. And that is what makes a historian's work extremely pertinent, difficult, no, no doubt, and also extremely relevant to the times, I think all time, but in today's time, because people are so interested and fascinated by history. So it is our sort of job to make sure that history remains not just relevant, but equally important, complicated, and complex for people to understand. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for that brilliant lecture. And I think this has widened our horizons when we think of women, when we think of British India, and these women who were invisible of sorts in the grand narrative of history. So thank you for uncovering those for us, and I hope that there might be more and more people who are listening to us right now who would venture into this field and write more histories, because there is a dearth of research, sadly. And now the young researchers like Dr. Sharma and others are trying to bring that back. So, but I think the question is also this, that a lot of time that I think you also pointed out, historians make the mistake of belittling the people. They think that the public do not know enough and that they don't know anything. So we have to be more general when we talk about history. But that's when you also kind of move away from the kind of principles of history. So thank you so much for pointing that out also. And that's what we have been doing here, that even if we don't get that much audience, we at least reach out to the people who might be able to learn from this and might be able to change their perspectives about the past. But that brings me to the question that wills are more subjective in nature. They are written by people. But when we think of the broader social history, this history of women, which might be for a historian a more objective um, subject of study, how do you use something as subjective as a will to reconstruct that broader social history? Because it's a very new kind of a source material for history students. Been taught, we have been trained to look at only at the archival, the gazetteers and official records. These are not official records per se, these are personal records.
Shall I answer the question, Nishan? Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that's a very sort of a difficult question to start with. But I agree that belittling the people might also be a colonial kind of a hangover. I often see people using such difficult, jargonish kind of words, not because they want to intimidate the reader, but I think they also want to be taken very seriously. Academia can be very harrowing kind of a space. If you don't use jargons, it means you're not an engaging academic. I'm glad that we are changing that, because it means that I can complicate my argument without necessarily using a thesaurus. I can say a very difficult thing, but make sure that I say it, because when I'm a teacher, I've been teaching for so long, the onus of explaining lies on me, right? Unless and until I'm able to communicate my ideas, the students will not even want to listen to me. Same way as a writer, as a historian, unless and until I say what I want to say in the most lucid way possible, I can't expect people to follow my arguments just the way I want them to understand. So I think, yes, you are absolutely right that we have to make sure that, without compromising with the principles of history, staying in our domains. If you ask me to comment on something on 8th century, I will completely refuse, because that's not my domain. I might have a perspective reading secondary material, but I will not be able to, speak like an expert. And I will rather sit with you and hear an expert speak to gain something, out of it. Similarly, I think, yes, bills remain subjective, but I think one has to again contextualize what you are reading in the wills. So, for example, if you start reading the political history, the legal history of that time, you realize that, when you study the language of the will. So, for example, there was this, Hyde, the Justice Hyde, whose court cases I saw. Some of his court cases, by the way, are digitized and you all can access them online. One of the court cases in which there is this case of burglary where a man, Indian man, is going to steal something from this house. Now, when they bring him to the court and they ask him, why were you, so he actually says he was not going there to steal. He actually is having an affair with the wife of that man. Now, within the conversation between the judges, they start saying that the woman is 35-year-old. How is it possible that a man will take a risk to go to have an affair with a 35? Now you realize that this is actually 1790s. And you actually see the kind of biases that the social history, which are mentioned in the travelogues, which are mentioned in some of the proceedings of that time, being reflected in a place as well when two judges are talking to each other. So I think when you start contextualizing your archive, even if the archive, because some of the wills are so detailed, I think they were 8 to 10 pages long. when you start the details. So they will give details of what they are leaving. So if it's a set of silver spoons, they'll mention 12 silver spoons, a bowl, and you realize that the whole idea of writing a wasihat, the idea of writing a will, is something that is not indigenous to South Asia, so to speak, right? I mean, you see that primogeniture is the law, the idea of women being given things at the marriage. So these are also, because a lot of Indian wills also start to come in the Calcutta, the High Court, I mean, at that time, the Supreme Court. And you see that once you start contextualizing what is being mentioned, it's not that far away. The only thing that remains new for me is the history of these women, because they are not mentioned anywhere. So for me, if you ask me what is the caste of these women, I may not be able to tell you unless I study it with Bletchenden's diaries, William Hickey's memoirs, other letters by some of these people who are writing the letters back home, some private papers of some people, because you match the information and you realize that the household structures, for example, they're always cribbing that in India you can't keep one servant because of the caste system. That's a continuous rant you find in memoirs and writings. And then when you see the hirkaras, the servants, there are 10 servants in one household, it makes sense. So I think it's juxtaposing two different kind of archives that I was able to, at least I tried doing that, to be honest. Yes.
And talking about the archives, the winner of last year Caravan Book Prize was Elizabeth Lost, and her book, Everyday Islamic Law in the Making of Modern South Asia, talks about these archives which are still uh, not covered widely in the academic circles. Another question I think also is about the non-marital cohabitations between the British men and the native women. So, what was the social context to those relationships? And I think this whole concept of non-marital cohabitation still, I think, haunts India in the modern times. So, how did people perceive those at that time?
Actually, when you read travel logs, they often comment on this because they're really surprised at how okay they are actually. How, I mean, how in, at least for Indian social context, they are not seen as, because like, for example, in the court cases, there is no moral condemnation of either Piru Bibi or Bhagwan Kunwar. There's also one of the rape cases where the BB Kitty is mentioned, who is one of the witnesses. There is no moral condemnation of these women at all for living in even the social structures. So I would like to believe, and many of the Britishers comment on that. They say that how it sort of is seen as okay. They're as acceptable as marital cohabitations. So I really like what Kenneth Ball Hatchett wrote in his work. He says that because it suited the British, having wives here would have been very, very expensive. Um, Prostitution or sex work, again, something that the British sort of own their an enlightened morality would have condemned. Homosexuality was absolutely something they were. So that's why they start making these lal bazaars and cantonment area, sort of systemizing sex work for the Britishers as well. So in that situation, to have, I mean, Thompson writes that it was encouraged in a way that each man who comes here, and they're very young when they're coming here, right, as either as the entry level army officers or writers as clerks. So they would be encouraged to have a woman taking care, because taking care would mean managing the household. And in fact, Thompson says that in the army, many a times the men would approach the mistress if they had a request to be made to the senior officers, because that kind of social network. And William Thompson's it's a huge text. He writes about his presence in the army in Bengal in the 18th century. And again, what he writes matches perfectly with the other sources. Again, Sita Ram, who writes in the 19th century. Again, he's a Subadar, who writes his experience in the British Army. You realize that how similar the structure is from the late 18th to around the mid 19th century as far as the presence of Indian women. So for cooking, for taking care of them if they're injured, and also keeping them in check, which probably might be a reference to homosexuality or abusing themselves in terms of their physical physicality of it. There's a very sort of kind of a Victorian fear of what will happen if it's not managed. So Paul Hatchett says that, which is why even when the civilian men do not have native mistresses or don't talk about native mistresses, the British government turns a blind eye to men in the army continuing to have these native mistresses. So I think it's also a necessity as far as the British early empire experiences is concerned. And I think for the Indians, I think it would have been not that big a issue as one would imagine it to be.
And what happened to these women if and when the men left them? So were they again went back to their homes? Were they accepted by the society?
Yeah. Because it is very. In fact, I should have mentioned that. So often the wills, the men will write to their wills executors that after I have gone or after I've died, they'll praise. If they praise the woman that she's very good natured and she's been very sort of this thing, they ask the executors of will to make sure that they provide her with another master. So it's very done because women never get the children. That's a very, very sort of patrilineal patriarchal structure. The children will always belong to the father. So sometimes, like one of the wills says that when you take the child away from her, please do it very gently. She's very attached to the child. There are things like that. That's what make these wills so much more than just a legal document. Why would you write that unless and until you care about the person you are mentioning in the will, that please be very careful. One man says that she's in the garden house. When you bring her to the city, make sure you arrange the boat properly. Her comfort is of the and you realize that, oh my god, he's going on writing in a legal document something that has no legal repercussions whatsoever. And for me, you see, that is what makes a wills so much more than legal archives. But the women, it was very easy for them to move to another master. Because again, Blechenden's diaries, he talks about the fact that sometimes if a BB could not get another master, they were fearful that what if she has to resort to sex work. So they will often, these men in Bengal, they would try and get some kind of pension being given to her so that she has a basic money. So there was a kind of a social understanding among these, at least the men, who would be a little better off in terms of finances, but also a little sociable in the sense they wanted to keep a track of these things.
There's a question on YouTube by Shivangi. Her question is, did it impact shaping the legal discourse in any way?
Legal, okay. I think the legal discourse does actually not mention this, other than the fact that by the mid 19th century, when they're setting up the pension for the widows of those who die in the army, earlier it's only open to the white wives. Then they sort of broaden it to the women who were married, but even non-whites. So they had to produce a marriage certificate. And it opens up gradually. That's the only example I saw of that. And a very early example of, I think, 1687, which is also the time when Portuguese are in India in large number, where the board of directors announced that, 5 pagoda to be given if the child is, if the child is brought up as a Protestant, right? It was a way to challenge the children being raised as Catholics by the Portuguese. So that reference, but other than that, they don't make any provisions for the native mistress. Even if they were married, there is no provision. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for taking out time to deliver this lecture. And I think this is the best start of the new series of lectures that we'll do this year. And thank you for choosing such a interesting theme, because there's so much to venture from this point onwards. The situation, the conditions of those women after the men left the country or died. And I think there might be more archives waiting to be uncovered. And
Sure.
I hope
Yes.
that people can get the book. It is out now. I think it's published by Taylor and Francis India, and it is available online. You can get the copy through the Taylor and Francis website. I think it is also available on Amazon so that you can get your copies. And Dr. Sharma is found in Delhi, so you can get them autographed whenever you meet her or attend her classes. I am told that she's one of the most popular teachers in Delhi University circles. So whenever you are there, do have a chat with her, have conversations. And it is important that we host conversations with historians at different venues in different cities. Host more conversation is the thing that we want to start. So thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for speaking to us, for delivering this lecture, and for sharing so many insights about the legal and social history of colonial Bengal, especially in relation to the study of women, because my research in the last few months has been on the representation of women in Indian cinema. So for me particularly, it was very interesting to listen to you speak about status of women legally in a much more older time than the cinema, because cinema came in the 19th century and 20th century, but this we are talking about the 18th century. So thank you so much once again. It was truly an honor hosting you on Caravan.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great experience to interact, with people who love history for the sake of history. So thank you. It's such a great opportunity for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Keep listening to Caravan. Do follow us on social media handles, Caravan Heritage. We are going to do a session tomorrow, Sunday, 4th February, which is a closed room Zoom conversation on Shakti Samanta and women in Shakti Samanta films, of course, because Shakti Samanta made Aradhana, Amar Prem, and so many more films that talk Kashmir Ki Kali, that talk about a lot of things and issues that were discussed here also. So we will talk about those in that session. So if you want to join in, you can send in a message on Instagram to us at Caravan Heritage. We'll send the Zoom link to all of you. And if you are already on our WhatsApp group, you will get the link there. So don't worry. Thank you so much, and we'll be back with another lecture very soon for you. Keep reading, keep questioning, keep thinking. That's how you'll keep